We now have the privilege of hearing about the SDGs from Dr. Friedrich Soltau. He's a Senior Sustainable Development Officer at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Friedrich served as a member of the core team that supported the United Nations General Assembly Open Working Group on the SDGs. Before that, he was a lead analyst for the Sustainable Development governance issues in the Rio+20 Conference Secretariat. Since then, he has worked with matters related to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. Friedrich, welcome and thank you for being part of our workshop.
Thank you, Willem. I'm very pleased to join you. Thank you.
So the first question is a sort of general question, and it's the following. How, in your view, are the SDGs different from the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals?
Thank you very much. Well, maybe before I preface, I should say what I'm going to say is obviously in my personal views and experience. But a key question, you know, the MDGs really put poverty eradication on the agenda, with people like Bono and others brought into the debate, a set of 8 targets, very focused. And when they came to an end, the question for the international community was what comes next? And the SDGs have a few distinctions. First of all, of course, they build on the MDGs. That's very clear. One key distinction is the MDGs are really focused on poorer countries and sort of a donor-beneficiary relationship, whereas the SDGs are universal, they're for everyone. Every single country is given tasks and has duties under the SDGs. That's one huge difference. Another difference is that the MDGs were quite focused on improvements on aggregate. Let's have a 20% reduction of this, an improvement on that. Whereas the SDGs are universal in a second sense. They try and go to universal energy access, universal healthcare. So that's a much more ambitious and aspirational sort of take on the huge task. And also importantly, while the MDGs, as I said, will focus on poverty, the SDGs are much broader. We cover climate change, we cover industrialization issues, we cover equity issues. So it's a much broader set of tasks that the international community has taken up with the SDGs. And the last difference perhaps is that but very important one, is that the MDGs were taken from a declaration at the UN, but the real details were worked out by technocrats, UN staff members, experts, academics, whereas the SDGs were developed by member states. They had held the pen all the way through. So it's really their agenda, they designed it, they own it.
Fascinating. I mean, building on that topic, I mean, you were most likely privy to discussions and then insights that many of us were not privy to, have not been privy to, as it relates to the negotiations that led to what we currently call the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. Are there specific factors or interests that influenced the negotiations that led to the formulation and the eventual adoption of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs?
I think one point certainly, which maybe ties back to the MDGs, was this desire to be universal, to bring a broader set of countries in and move to a more universal agenda. Another push we saw during the negotiations was for countries to say, we've diagnosed a problem. A key overarching problem for the international community is poverty eradication. That's mentioned in the agenda. But for instance, African countries said, we see that, but we also want to have a hand in the solution. So we have SDG 8 and 9, which talk about employment, which talk about infrastructure, saying we want to get to grips with the problem. You know, so that's a strong push from a certain group of countries highlighting what they would like to do. We saw that developing in the agenda. We also saw, I would say, issues around climate change coming in strongly, cities, so things which had not been there before. Interest groups and countries had a strong feeling to pull those in. And I would also mention in this context SDG 16, which is on peaceful, on strong institutions, peace and governance. And that SDG, which was sometimes quite controversial, again, was something where some member states felt we really need peace for development. And of course, the other way around, we can't have peace without development.
Now, you've alluded to some of the topics covered by the SDGs, SDG 16, strong institutions, governance. We can think of SDGs such as number 3, covering health, 4, education. There's a long list of topics covered by the SDGs. Now, in my experience, one of the innovations brought about by the SDGs is that they represent an interlinked system, for a lack of a better word. Now, many institutions trying to mainstream the SDGs embrace this notion of a large number of focus areas, in some sense interlinked, but they find it tricky to operationalize, to make it practical. Do you have any advice for such organizations?
Definitely. So as you said, 17 goals, 169 targets, it can seem a bit overwhelming. Like, how do we get to grips with the sort of plethora of objectives? I mean, first of all, I would say most institutions, and this is again a key point I should have mentioned, is that self-consciously, the agenda and the SDGs talk about everyone being involved, the private sector, CSO. So it's not an agenda for governments only. It says that in the 2030 agenda, it's not for governments. So that being the case, there's a target there for every actor that's concerned about transforming our world. So that's one key. You can drill down and find a target that speaks to your organization, whether private sector, CSO, or government. However, as you've mentioned, how do we connect that? That target on its own, its implementation won't be effective. And there are tools looking at what we call a systems approach to say, let's think about this as a system. If we're talking about healthcare, what do we need around that? Do we need to have schools? If we think about healthcare, what about infrastructure, roads? So that way of thinking practically and linking the targets to each other. So we can do this at a practical way, sitting down with stakeholders and looking at interlinkages from the perspective of those involved. Then we also go to more complex systems modeling done with a lot of data, quantitative modeling. So there's several levels. But the point you made, Willem, is really critical. The key takeaway is, let's pick the target or the targets that concern us. The second level then should be, how do those link to others? If we want to maximize the impact, we have to think about the interlinkages. We have to think, as you mentioned, what else feeds in? Are there synergies? And sometimes are there trade-offs? Are they going to be, if we push too hard in this direction, are we going to cut ourselves short in another area?
So am I understanding correctly that if we're serious about the interlinkages sort of implicit in the SDGs, does that mean that we actually do need to create and participate in platforms, discussions that go beyond our institution to see where our contribution lies and what others are doing? Any thoughts on that?
Definitely. So the agenda said it's interlinked and indivisible. The goals are interlinked and indivisible. So basically saying, let's not cherry pick what your priority, but don't cherry pick. And then absolutely. And as I mentioned, I think the first way to get to grips with those interlinkages is to work in a multi-stakeholder way, to say, okay, who else is involved? Sit down, prioritize, think through, map through, and there's simple tools or even approaches for doing that, looking at those interlinkages, seeing who else is involved. And as I think you're alluding to, at the institutional level, it's also a challenge for institutions and organizations not to work in that silo approach, to say, we may have our focus and that makes us effective, but to go to the next step, we also have to branch out and look at those interlinkages in our analysis, but also in our institutional links with other organizations. Are we working together as an association, let's say, of a business association? Are we saying we work in this sector and you work in that sector? How are we looking at this in our organization through our business, our work streams or branches? Are we bringing this down to the different levels? Are they talking to each other about sustainability, or is it staying in sort of one department only? And that's from the business side. This is an ongoing struggle, I think, within organizations to have that communication about strategic objectives. And if the SDGs become a strategic objective for an organization or a government, then that kind of, that sort of cross-fertilization needs to happen.
Now, I mean, so to a large extent, building on your answer now, sort of it's made explicit in the 2030 agenda, SDGs, that it's about the whole of society. It's not only governments, but civil society organizations, educational institutions, private sector, the list goes on. Yet, often when non-government entities look at the SDGs, it's as if it's driven by governments or by multilateral organizations such as the UN. And sometimes organizations wonder, apart from sort of prioritizing internally, where they fit in. Now, within this context, as the SDGs being a whole of society program, how should all organizations that are not government think about their role, the contribution in this context? Yeah,
just to really re-emphasize it, the whole of society approach, it is an agenda, developed in a multi-stakeholder way. And the assumption and the underlying driver is it will be implemented through a whole of society approach. But of course, bringing that awareness out and building that ownership is a key point. So the UN, has efforts afoot. We have the UN Global Compact, which tries to drive sustainability and the SDGs out to the business sector. There's a strong, call on governments to involve civil society in their policy making. But you're quite right. When we look at sometimes at how countries are doing others, one key, and it's a self-admitted sort of area of challenge, is awareness, creating awareness about the agenda, whether it's translating it into local languages, whether it's putting it on television, whether it's having, influencers involved. There's always a challenge in trying to communicate. And that feeling often is, when it's done and decided either at the corporate level or at the UN level, that's it. That's a huge mistake. So I think it's be a continuous push, even now that we're really well into the agenda with 6-7 years in, we still have to push on the awareness and communication side. And unfortunately, that's something where, the international organizations and perhaps governments, that's not their strongest suit, communication, awareness raising, that's absolutely critical.
Then in conclusion, one last question. As you know, many, if not all of our participants hail from business schools, commerce faculties. Do you have any last words of advice for our participants?
I would just say, take it in hand. I mean, for us, when we look as who are there and who work with this, what's most exciting is when we see people take this up who are not governments, who are not civil society actors, who are not, I would say, the usual suspects whose day-to-day work is in this area. The most exciting thing is to see corporate leaders, people in academia take this to heart. And I think that ultimately the success of the sustainable development agenda really rests on that. And take it to heart, see what it does for you. Is it a competitive advantage? Isn't it something which you can use for awareness raising, building commitments within your company or in your organization to a larger objective? It links what you do, wherever you are, to a much bigger global agenda. And I think that's part of the excitement. Take it up and in a creative way. Go for it.
Thank you very much for those wise words. Thanks for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Willem.